Chapter 115, Walking on Water. This chapter is updated by Novels.pl. This is the half-saint's sacred glyph of predecessor Liu Xu. Zhang Yuochen admired Liu Xu so much that he gave a slight bow toward the half-saint's sacred glyph to show respect to predecessor Liu Xu. When Liu Shuaihan noticed Zhang Yuochen saluting toward the glyph, her eyes brightened and she gave a slight nod. It was possible that her appreciation of Zhang Yuochen was increasing. Even though he was an outstanding, talented warrior, he behaved humbly at all times, and that would lead him to a splendid future. Liu Shuaihan said, "There are altogether 1,894 creeks, 325 brooks, 64 rivers, 9 streams, and a massive sea on the half-saint's sacred glyph. The creek, brook, river, stream, and the sea represent 5 different realms of spiritual power. Let's try and see if you can reach any of the realms." Zhang Yuochen nodded. He sat cross-legged under the glyph and fully released his spiritual power. At the same time, Liu Shuaihan lifted up her white robe slightly and sat next to Zhang Yuochen. She also activated her spiritual power and looked closely at the half-saint's sacred glyph. Beep, beep. Shortly after, both of their spiritual power had simultaneously entered the half-saint's sacred glyph and arrived on a piece of land that was surrounded by water that was shuttling back and forth. Liu Shuaihan looked like a white sacred butterfly as she exposed her snow-white legs with bare feet and walked into the water. Eventually, she walked to the middle of the creek, looking like something out of a fairy tale. She turned around and looked at Zhang Yuochen, who was standing on the shore. She said with her soft voice, as if she had turned into an angel, "There are thousands of pathways for cultivation. Yet, all the pathways will, in the end, converge into one and lead everyone in the same direction. In the world, 3,000 pathways, and yet, the same goal will be reached," said Zhang Yuochen. Then, he walked over to the creek and closed his eyes. When he lifted up his leg and stepped on the surface of the water, his soul sunk down slightly but did not fall into the water in the end. He did not think too much, but just kept walking. Both of his feet moved along the water's surface toward Liu Shuaihan as if he was walking on the ground. When Liu Shuaihan noticed that Zhang Yuochen could walk on the surface of the water, she nodded her head slightly. She continued to walk following the water current. Zhang Yuochen quickened his pace and caught up with Liu Shuaihan on her left. They walked side by side with both of their eyes shut. There was a sense of peacefulness and coziness and no words could explain how amazing that was. "Zhang Yuochen, your talent is indeed very high. Higher than all the geniuses that I've ever met. Can you tell me how you cultivate your spiritual power to such heights?" Liu Shuaihan kept her eyes closed and continued walking by relying on her instincts. "Senior Sister Apprentice Liu, I'm sorry but I can't expose that to anyone. I'd prefer keeping the secret to myself," Zhang Yuochen said as an apology. Liu Shuaihan did not force him to answer. She then asked, "Well, do you know what exactly the spiritual power is?" Zhang Yuochen responded, "Since human brains are full of potential, the spiritual power comes from the spiritual stage of our brains. Ordinary people can only utilize 1/10 of their brains. Therefore, their spiritual power is only at level 10. By practicing spiritual power, we can open up the treasure house in our brains and display different possibilities." It is said that if ordinary people who have never practiced martial arts were able to use up to 50% of their brain, which is equal to level 50 of their spiritual power, then they would be able to break through the limitation of human beings and become saints by refining spiritual power. A spiritual power saint is scarier than a martial arts saint. Some of them are able to summon thunderbolts, some of them can control the clouds and rains, some can awaken dead bodies that have been dead for thousands of years, some can communicate with the gods, and some can predict the future. Liu Shuaihan nodded and said, "Spiritual power saints are indeed stronger and stranger than martial arts saints. Yet, becoming a spiritual power saint is hundreds or 1,000 times harder than becoming a martial arts saint. When it comes to the later stage of practicing spiritual power, the degree of difficulty will be doubled. Elevating to one level higher is as difficult as climbing up into the sky. For example, Elder Yu Jingchen, who has practiced spiritual power for 80 years and reached level 39, needs at least 40 more years. if he wants to reach level 40 of his spiritual power. But, do you think he still has 40 more years left to live? At this time, they had passed through the creek and entered a brook. Once again, they walked on the brook's surface and made their way toward the river. The water current in the brook became rapid. There was a strong wind on the water's surface, which stopped Luo Shuaihan and Zhang Yuochen from going forward. Shortly after, they entered the river. The water current of the river was even more turbulent. The wind on the water's surface was also getting stronger. It seemed as if both of them were going to be blown away. When they had finally crossed half of the river, Luo Shuaihan's voice entered into Zhang Yuochen's ears. She said, "This is my limit, I can't go any farther." Zhang Yuochen stopped and looked at Luo Shuaihan next to him. Luo Shuaihan's entire body had been submerged in the water with only her beautiful face barely remaining above the water's surface. He had no idea when it had happened. If she kept going forward, she would definitely drown. Luo Shuaihan said, "I'll stay and practice here. Once my spiritual power has increased, I'll be able to float up and go farther. Take care." Zhang Yuochen could do nothing to help, so he kept moving forward, hoping that Luo Shuaihan would be able to catch up with him. Walking out from the river, Zhang Yuochen entered a wider stream. If he followed the water flow of the stream, he would be able to reach the sea. From the creek to the brook to the river to the stream, and the stream to the sea. Zhang Yuochen's field of view had been getting wider, which required a stronger spiritual power the farther that he went. When he first stepped into the stream, his legs sunk down slightly with the water coming up to his ankles. He continued moving 3,000 meters forward, where the water reached his knees. 2,000 meters more and the water had risen to his waist. Another 2,000 meters and the water was up to his chest. Despite the difficulties and obstacles, Zhang Yuochen kept going step by step, requiring overwhelming effort to move forward. Yet, he never thought of giving up. The water in the stream had been hammering his spiritual power. When he was immersed in the water up to his neck, Zhang Yuochen did not have a choice but to stop and struggle with the water current so he could maintain his breathing and not drown. Time slowly passed by. Zhang Yuochen's body eventually floated up and the water had gone down to his waist. Suddenly, Luo Shuaihan shouted from the shore, "Zhang Yuochen, it's time." Zhang Yuochen awoke from the process of elevating his spiritual power. He looked toward Luo Shuaihan at the shore and asked, "That's too fast." Luo Shuaihan said, "If you decide to choose the path of the spiritual power saint, I can lend you this half-saint's sacred glyph so that you can keep refining your spiritual power. But, you'll have to give up practicing martial arts. If you decide to continue practicing martial arts, you have to leave the half-saint's sacred glyph now." Zhang Yuochen certainly understood what Luo Shuaihan meant. A warrior could surely practice both martial arts and spiritual power. However, he could not overindulge himself in practicing spiritual power. Otherwise, it would greatly affect his martial arts. This was a taboo that a warrior always needed to avoid. It was impossible for Zhang Yuochen to give up martial arts. Therefore, he made his way toward the shore. At the same time, he noticed that there was a faint human shadow on the river's surface far away. The shadow stood in the middle of the water's surface as if he was demonstrating a high-level fist technique. Yet, the human shadow disappeared in a second when Zhang Yuochen looked over again. "What are you looking at?" Luo Shuaihan asked. "I think I just saw a human shadow that looked very much like predecessor Luo Xu." Zhang Yuochen responded. Luo Shuaihan was surprised. There was a sense of curiosity showing in her eyes. She asked instantly, "What was the human shadow doing?" Zhang Yuochen shook his head slightly and said, "When I looked over again, the shadow had already disappeared. Perhaps I didn't see clearly." Luo Shuaihan looked disappointed and said, "Maybe you did see clearly. There's a high possibility that it was the illusory image of my ancestor practicing his martial arts. Maybe." Zhang Yuochen did not worry too much about it. He left the water and went over to the shore. Luo Shuaihan appeared to be frustrated. She glanced at Zhang Yuochen and asked, "Do you know which level your spiritual power is at after practicing in the glyph?" Zhang Yuochen smiled and replied, "I'm not too sure." "Level 34, Luo Shuaihan exclaimed. Zhang Yuochen was not surprised by his achievement. The Court of Gods had greatly elevated his spiritual power last time. Reaching level 34 was not something that was out of his expectation. Luo Shuaihan continued. Do you know what the level of my ancestor's spiritual power was when he reached half-saint? His spiritual power was only at level 38 at that time. And when he became a saint, he had broken through level 40. Zhang Yuochen, you have already reached level 34 at the advanced stage of the Black Realm. I guess you can be ranked in the top 10 throughout the history of the entire Kunlun's field. If you give up martial arts and focus on spiritual power now, there will be a 50% chance for you to become a spiritual power saint. Zhang Yuochen certainly understood what Luo Shuaihan was saying. He looked determined and said, there's no way that I'll give up martial arts. Okay then. You are the one who decides which way to go. Follow your heart. Luo Shuaihan added, regarding your spiritual power level, I won't tell anyone. This secret is safe with me. Thank you so much, Senior Sister Apprentice Luo. Zhang Yuochen said with appreciation. Afterward, Luo Shuaihan and Zhang Yuochen left the half-saint's sacred glyph and walked toward the Divine Power Palace. Watching Luo Shuaihan and Zhang Yuochen walking out of Divine Power Palace together, the students that had been waiting outside the palace all revealed looks of jealousy and envy. Especially Yuchi Tankang and Prince Huoxing. They were extremely jealous of Zhang Yuochen. They kept staring at Zhang Yuochen as if they wanted to kill him with their menacing gazes. The door of the Divine Power Palace had been closed again. The 12 students all made their way and left the palace. Going back to Black Number 1, Zhang Yuochen was going to enter the time and space spinal and practice the sword technique to prepare for the quarterly assessment held in 2 months. Bang! The door of his room was opened by a palm. Juan Muxingling rushed into his room with a weird smile on her face. She asked, Zhang Yuochen, has Senior Sister Apprentice Luo brought you to the 3rd level of the Divine Power Palace? Zhang Yuochen smiled and said, yes, she did. Juan Muxingling asked, what is on the 3rd level of Divine Power Palace? That I can't tell you, Zhang Yuochen responded. Juan Muxingling stared at him angrily and said, fine. Keep the secret to yourself. I was going to tell you what you need to pay attention to at the quarterly assessment in 2 months. But since you won't tell me about the 3rd level, I won't tell you about that either. Zhang Yuochen laughed bitterly and exclaimed, Senior Sister Apprentice Juan Mu, I really can't tell you. Juan Muxingling stared at Zhang Yuochen harshly. All of a sudden, she put a gorgeous smile on her face. Okay. But you need to tell me your method to practice spiritual power to such a terrifying level. Zhang Yuochen thought for a while and said with sincerity, talent. Juan Muxingling clenched her fists tightly and wanted to choke him to death.